Hi there. So sorry I can't be with you today. Today we were due to be covering dictionaries, so I thought I'd put a quick video together on it to guide you through sort of the main concepts behind it, really. And the beauty of it, if you watch it on your own computer, you can always just stop and then like rewind bits and go over bits if you need to. So you can find uh, this kind of printout from the book is in 2.6 collections on Replit. So there's some exercises there in kind of file 3 and 4 to have a look at. So we've already looked at arrays, but as a quick recap, as dictionaries are kind of similar to arrays, but they kind of build on it basically. So we looked at how we could create an array by basically writing the keyword var to store it in, because most of the time with arrays, we do actually want to change them a lot of the time. So their example is then to create an array of names. So basically, collections are ways of storing like related data in some way, yeah? But quite simple data structures at this point. But basically like a bunch of names maybe, or a load of numbers which could represent high scores, or something like that. But you do use arrays quite a lot when you're building something. So we then give it a name. It's quite useful to pluralize the name because an array is usually a collection of things, basically more than one. Then we use equal to assign, and we use square brackets, remember, for arrays. So we could put some names in, like Bob, and then remember every element is comma separated, so we put commas in. So we'll have Sarah, and then we can have Frank. Yeah, so we've got this. Remember, we can call methods on our array now. So we could say, well, names, so the name of the array dot count is a really common one, right? So if I wrap this in a print statement like that and then run this, it should return 3 because it's counted. There are 3 things in the array. We can also remember go names dot append, and all this stuff here Replit gives you, just get rid of it. They're trying to help you out, but we can just get rid of that. And let's add Lucy to the list. And then if we just print the list straight this time, names, then like that. If I open this out a little bit, we've got Bob, Sarah, Frank, Lucy. And remember, we can loop on arrays as well. So we can write for name in names, right? So this is the temporary variable is name here. Names with an S is the name of the array. And then I can then create a code block. And now every time we go through, name is going to become Bob, and then it will become Sarah and Frank. So if I said print, like, let's do it as a statement. So user, and then use backslash brackets and insert name, right? So name here comes from this, and this becomes every element of the array every time we loop through. Every iteration, it becomes Bob, then Sarah, then Frank. So we should get something like user Bob, user Sarah, user Frank, and then user Lucy, obviously, because we added Lucy there. So there we go, user Bob, Sarah, Frank, Lucy. Cool. So that's a really quick overview. I'll get rid of the loop, but that's a really quick overview of arrays. You can put numbers in them, obviously. You can actually in Swift combine data types and have like strings and numbers, but it's not that useful. And if you're needing to do that, there's a better way of doing it that we'll cover a bit later on. There are other methods as well, like dot contains. So we could say something like if names dot contains, and then let's look for Sarah, right? And then let's print, we found. So we could hardcode Sarah like that, or we could even write like names index 1. The only problem with that is that if we inserted someone before, that would change. But we could print this, for instance. So we found Sarah. And remember, the way that we access elements of an array is by writing names, and then square brackets, and then the index number. So if I want to find Bob, Bob is at index 0, right? So if I now print this, so wrap in a print statement, just like that. So names, square bracket 0, we found Bob and printed him out. So moving on to dictionaries. That was a quick little recap of arrays. There we go. So dictionaries. So basically dictionaries, the big difference is that in our array, we have basically like one value, comma, then another value, comma, then another value. So each value is just one thing. Whereas in a dictionary, you've kind of got like this key and a value, right? So, and then a comma, and then another key and its value, comma, then another key and its value. So what we could store, for instance, which I think they got on the next page, is like high scores. But var high scores equals, right, square brackets because it's a collection type. So let's go Bob, but this time Bob, you'll see the difference now, colon, and we'll give him a value. So Bob has 500 points. Then we'll go Sarah. So you got 550 points. And then we will go for Frank. And Frank only got 100 points. He's not so good, right? So we've basically now got a dictionary. So we've got, for every kind of comma separated element of this dictionary, it's got a key and a value. Now, one of the things that's very different from arrays is arrays are like very well organized in terms of like Bob is at index 0, Sarah's at index 1, Frank is at index 2, and so on, right? With a dictionary, they're not stored in order. So when I print this, I don't know if it will let me just straight print it. I don't think it will. We can give it a try, see if it will let us do it. Right, well, there we go. So if we just straight print this, it has actually stored them in that order. Let's try moving them around in that case. And try it again. So it's printing them back in the order that they've been put in. They're not necessarily stored in the same order because basically it's stored in a different way to arrays, which make them quite fast to look data up in, right? But you have to look it up with the key rather than the index now. So for instance, if I wanted to look up what Sarah's score was, I could do high scores, right, square brackets just before, but instead of an index number now, I'm going to put Sarah in, right? Now I'm going to get some warnings, I think. Let's have a look. New script. Oh, I thought I'd just get warnings, not errors. Let's have a quick look. Expression to resolve subscript. Scores Sarah. I've spotted the same on it yet. So let's try wrapping it in a print statement. Yeah, so you see I've got all these kind of errors here. I'll sort those out in a moment. Well, they're not errors, they're warnings at this point. But you see what it's printing is now, instead of just 550, it's printing optional 550. So we haven't talked about optionals yet, but basically they represent the idea that actually Sarah could not exist in this dictionary. Like when we're looking it up, the computer doesn't necessarily know that Sarah definitely exists in here or not. So we have to kind of be a little bit careful. Now, if you look at the book, they use this syntax to it's called unwrapping, basically. We're going to talk about this later on. We do optionals. So you could use this kind of thing of say like, well, if let, so if we kind of look at the way that they've done it, we could say if let Sarah, I'll just put HS for high score is, and then we want this, so the name of the dictionary, and then we're going to look up the key, right? And then we have open and closing. Do you see this open and closing curly braces for a scope? And then we can do our work in here. So now I can actually cut this and paste this in here, right? So we run it. Hopefully. Oh no, I don't want to print that. I want to print Sarah HS, so the variable that's created up here. And I'll explain this in a second. Right, so now it's working, 550, no like optional 550. So if let is basically saying, well, if this exists, so high scores is the name of our dictionary and Sarah's the key. If Sarah exists in the dictionary, right, then store whatever you find there in Sarah HS or whatever I come up with here. This is like a temporary variable. So I could have called this like high score, and then I would need to make sure I use the same name down here, right? So that's what if let does, is say, well, if this thing over here exists and has a value, then store it in here. And then inside the code block, I can then use it, right? So that is the way that they're explaining that you could do this. And you could do it like this. This is how it's very common to unwrap optionals like this. However, for now, I would suggest you do it a little bit easier. So what we could do is say high scores, right, square brackets, and then we put the key in. So this time I'm going to look for Bob and see what his high score was. And then after the key, I'm going to put comma, default, right? And then I will give it a default value. So it should come up in auto completion, I think. It's not going to come up in auto completion, is it? So default value of 0, basically. So let's just see if this works. High scores. Got to spell stuff correctly, John, haven't you? So let's check that's the same. Let's print this. So there we go. We've managed to print out Bob's high score. So if I just kind of open up the print statement so you can see inside what it is, right? So we've got the name of the dictionary, and then you put the key, and then we have a comma to then add a default value by saying default colon. And the value here has to match the data type. So I couldn't write a string here because the data type of the values are integers, basically. So I have to write an integer here. That's a little trick because if you remember what we had before, it was like 3 lines of code. Well, I suppose 2 lines of code here, basically, with quite a lot of extra words rather than just adding a comma, default, and then colon 0. So this is what you would think that you would write, is high scores, then square brackets, and then the key to look it up. But if we add default, and then that, then we provide a default value, right? So that is one thing you want to be able to do. Other things you might want to be able to do is add things to the dictionary. So if we say high scores equals, and then we could basically give it like a new value, basically. So for instance, if I wanted to add the key of a new name and a value, because that's what we're doing here, right, is I add the key after here in square brackets. So let's create the name. Let's stick with our Lucy. And Lucy has got maybe 250 points, right? So this is how we can like add a new value to it. So if we just like print high scores and run it, right? So we are now getting, do you see Lucy is now coming in before Sarah? So you can see like it is kind of random that the order is presenting in, basically. And Bob is now first. So it is a random order in terms of how they're stored and looked up in, but it does mean the lookup time is quite fast. So we've now kind of added Lucy with 250 points. So what we could do if we want to change someone is we basically use exactly the same syntax. So what I'm going to do now is say high scores, right? Scores, put Lucy again, but this time I'm going to change her scores to 300. So what this basically does is if you put the dictionary name and a key, if the key exists, right, or doesn't exist, then it creates it and adds the value. If the key already exists, so by now it already exists, Lucy already exists, right? Then it finds Lucy and it just updates the value, right? So I think this is quite nice, I think. Yeah, so now Lucy is 300. So it's like if you just put like a new key, it'll see, does the key exist? No, it doesn't. So it adds it as a new thing. If it does exist, it will update it. So that's quite nice and quite simple to do, to update and change values in a dictionary. One of the last things I wanted to show you that is quite useful to know is being able to loop through a dictionary, right? So we can say for, but this time we're going to create what is known as a tuple. So it's got sort of parentheses and then two variable names that we create. So for now, I'm going to say key and comma value. So we get the idea. Now we use the dictionary name, so high scores, and then we have our code block, right? So this is how to loop through a dictionary. So basically, because when we looped before, we just have one variable name to become like each element. But now like each element has two values, if you think about it, as a key and then a value. So this is going to be the key and this is going to be the value, right? So what we could do in here is like say print the key is, and then I'm going to insert key, right? So key comes from here and key will like loop through Sarah. This is the thing that won't necessarily go in order of how we wrote it. And we do a separate one for the print, the value is, and then backslash like that, and then we put value, right? So if we now run this, let's see what happens. Right, so we have the key is Sarah, the value is 550, right? And then we have the key is Bob, the value is 500, the key is Frank, the value is 100. The key is Lucy, the value is 300. Yeah, so what you would probably do though is change these. So like this could be player or lowercase John player, and change that now to player. And this would be maybe high score, because you want these things to be descriptive so we know actually what they mean, because you might write another loop for a different dictionary. You don't want to keep using key and value all the time. Yeah, so that's how to loop through. So basically, there's a really quick overview. They're quite similar to arrays, but they are not indexed in terms of where all the elements are. We use keys, basically. The key could be anything. It could be a number. So you could build a sort of, I suppose, an array using a dictionary where like the key would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and then have values. But basically, it's a way of sort of storing related data, which is quite nice. But you'll probably start to already think this is quite limited. And when we look at structs and classes, you can write way more complex data structures. But you might use dictionaries. And one of the things to understand is JSON as a kind of web, sort of format uses dictionaries. Basically, it's like a dictionary within a dictionary. So the value here could be another dictionary. Yeah, and then its value could be another dictionary, and things like that. So we can create dictionaries by saying var, high scores, and then kind of entering some data. You can see in the book as well how you can create empty dictionaries. There are like 3 ways, but I find the top way here is the most easy to remember because it's very similar to creating an empty array. So if you remember to create an empty array, you have var array name, right? And then you need to specify its data type, so like string, and then you can set it to like an empty array like that. So actually it's the bottom one here I find the easiest to remember because it's quite similar to how I like to do that. So like dictionary, right, dictionary is of type, but this time we're going to put, so for instance our dictionary below is like a string to an int, and then to that with a colon in the middle. just like how all these have like this colon in the middle, but separating the key and the value basically. So you put like the two data types on either side for the key and then the value, and then you have to put that in there to show that it's a dictionary basically you're trying to create. So that's how to create like empty arrays and dictionaries. So we can just straight hard code some stuff in. Remember, if you are going to like access elements, they are not necessarily there. So you're going to get this optional thing returned. So one way to fix that is to have like a comma and then default and then this colon and then like a default value of just 0. You know, if you don't find Bob, we could just use the default value of 0 to keep the kind of compiler happy for now. And then this is how we can kind of like add a new person and update. If they're there, then we can update the value. And this is how we can loop through a dictionary. The main difference between the loops we've been doing is that we now use a tuple. So we have player and high score, not just one value here, because a dictionary has like a key and a value. So this is a key and that's the value. So hopefully that's quite useful. So if you guys want to play around with this for a little bit, and then if you head back over to, if I go to Teams on Replit and go Develop in Swift, and if I scroll down, have a go at, if I go into 2.6 collections, right, and you should have done the arrays stuff, or got so far with like exercise 1 and 2 with arrays. There are some tests that you can have a go at in here as well, in the main file. But if you go down to exercise 3, dictionaries, you should be able to kind of hopefully have a look through. So for instance, like you could create a calendar out of a dictionary with like the string being the month and then the int being the number of days in that month basically, to store them. And that's where this kind of goes, getting you to change things and stuff like that basically. So help each other out, do the best you can, and then make sure for the last 10-15 minutes you go back to your workbook 3.1, it's criteria 3.1 in there, to add to arrays, because it should be, the 3.1 is about collection types. So you should talk about arrays and you should talk about dictionaries in there basically and what they are, and some code examples would be great.